Substance, Meaning and Consciousness. An Introduction by V.K. Kumar. Takeaways from Substance, Meaning and Consciousness. Physics deals with the material universe. Metaphysics deals with the underlying invisible interactions behind the material universe. Substance, Meaning and Consciousness is a generic metaphysical theory which provides the meaning behind the following questions. Who controls this universe? Where does he reside? How does he control us? What is life? What is death? I hope the readers of this book will enjoy the insight they get into these questions. Thank you. This ebook, entitled Substance, Meaning and Consciousness (SMC), is a compilation of a series of articles expounding the void field theory or VFT and its applications to the various facets of life as we see on the earth. Looking at the sectarian conflicts in various parts of the world on the one hand, and the increasing scale of natural calamities on the other hand, we were induced to brainstorm on a generic concept of existence, which can unite mankind behind the onerous task of surviving the climate challenge by minimizing the loss of lives, livelihood, and living habitats. Thus, theory called the VFT explains why a human being should refrain from infringing on the basic human rights of other members of the society for the benefit of all. The purpose of this book is to promote peaceful coexistence based on the principles of relativity, reciprocity, and mutual respect in all human relationships. We hope the readers of SMC will benefit from this generic concept of existence and be in a position to apply it to enrich their lives. Chapter 2: Form and Substance. Ever since the dawn of civilization, humans have been speculating about the reality behind matter, or Aristotle's substance. Starting with the Egyptian and Greek civilizations, and also the Oriental, Aryan and Chinese civilizations, we can find references to various concepts that have gradually evolved into the materialistic model advocated by science at present. Barton argues that these conceptual models of reality are only approximations which scientists use to explain a set of observed facts. As new observations come to light, with the help of technological advances, our worldview changes. Old concepts are replaced by in favor of new ones, which are better able to explain our observations. Form is associated with our body, and the body is made of 5 elements: air, water, fire and earth. And the fifth one is the void or the ether. The 5 elements of nature do find a mention in ancient Aryan texts like the Vedas and the Upanishads and form the basis of the Ayurvedic system of medicine. It is good to note that both Ayurveda and the traditional Chinese systems of medicine classify the body into 5 elements. Matter is thus what substances or materials are constituted of. Substances are found in nature in various shapes and sizes. In other words, substances exist in various forms. We commonly recognize 3 generic forms of substances, namely solid, liquid, and gas. Scientists recognize another generic form, plasma. We also find that the same substance can exist in different forms under different conditions. These intuitive concepts are essentially models by which we visualize existence. To the extent these models are conceptual, they impact our thought processes and reside in our mind. Next, we come to the important concept of the formless mind. Thought has no form and is controlled by the mind, which is also formless or void. Thus, existence can be understood as an interplay of void and forms, or the VF. Traditionally, the debate has been going on as to what controls whom. This is the genesis of the mind versus body debate. The mind is the controller of the vital functions of the body and is the repository of thought and related intellectual attributes of the IVF. The body is essentially a cage of atoms which translates thought into action. Right from birth, the IVF is continuously interacting with the EVF to draw sustenance and develop its mind as well as its body. The body is essentially made of 4 terrestrial elements: air, water, earth, and fire. It is the presence of the 5th element, namely the void, in the form of the mind that actuates the body and facilitates execution of the various human functions as a human being ought to. From this perspective, we conclude that mind is a void field, or essentially the same as the VF. The body is constituted out of terrestrial elements actuated by the VF in the form of the mind. There are only 2 entities in nature, the living and the non-living. The living is characterized by the ability to grow, reproduce, and age with time. The entity which controls these vital functions of the living is designated as the vital force, or the VF. The vital functions are contained within the body, and hence the VF controlling the living is designated as the internal vital force, or the IVF. Applying these concepts to human beings, the IVF is variously called as the self, the soul, or the Atma. Moving further, the rest of the universe, which is external to the body, is designated as the external vital force, or the EVF. Here the EVF includes all stars, planets, as well as the other IVFs which influence the course of events in the life of the IVF. Life is a sequence of events which influence the IVF, comprising of the following milestones: conception, birth, growth, adolescence, adulthood, aging, and death. Conception is a process by which the IVF comes into existence in the form of a single living cell. This process involves the interaction of the VF with the EVF, symbolically represented by the equation EVF plus VF equal to IVF. This is followed by the process of development, whereby the fetus grows from a single cell to a fully functional child. Birth is the process by which the IVF is born into the world, even though equation 1 strictly represents conception. Not all conceptions result in birth, and hence it is correct to identify equation 1 as the representative of birth. Right through the development process, the mother's vital systems offer sustenance to the growing fetus. Hence, the mother provides the formative EVF at the prenatal stage. Only the mother can disclose the identity of the father to the IVF. The blood relationship of the IVF is with the mother. The relationship with the father is congenital. Once born, the IVF is sustained by the immediate family. The earth provides air, water, and food as sustenance, and this forms the EVF at the growth phase of the IVF, which is commonly identified as childhood. Institutional learning also is a part of the growing EVF. With time, the IVF undergoes a transition to adolescence, whereby the IVF acquires the adult features. Growth continues through adolescence to adulthood. Adulthood is characterized by the stabilization of the external form of the IVF. Thus, humans are identified by their form. The formative EVF provides the IVF with life skills, which are used by the IVF lifelong to provide sustenance for self and other family members. During the course of adulthood, the IVF develops congenital relationships with other IVFs to facilitate procreation. The VF plays an important role in these relationships and is instrumental in driving the procreation process to a successful result. Towards the end of the active procreation period, aging sets in, and the body of the IVF shows signs of aging. Essentially, this signals the start of a metaphysical transition, which ultimately results in the migration of consciousness of the IVF and its merger with the greater consciousness. This final milestone is the life in the life of the IVF is identified as death and is characterized by the equation IVF minus VF equal to I. When VF transgresses the IVF, that is, what is left behind is the I, which are the temporal remains of the IVF or the individual. These are returned to the earth respectfully by way of cremation or burial. The significance of the I or the Aham is the temporal identity or ego of the IVF. If the IVF can overcome the I, it can be one with the VF during this lifetime. Of existence. Earliest metaphysical thinkers were religious leaders. They contemplated on many philosophical questions, including the relationship between the IVF and the EVF. And they recorded their thoughts in the form of scriptures. They dealt with contemporary existential issues. The leaders of religious thought are no more, they are void. But their thought lives on in scriptures, form. Religious thought is propagated by void and form, or the VF. To summarize, the manifestations of the VF include the actuator of living and the non-living forms, the void field separating the electrons and the nucleus, the void field keeping electrons in perpetual motion and preventing them from crashing into the nucleus and annihilating themselves, as the astronomical bodies in rhythmic movement through the void being actuated by spin-related vortex force, as faith and religion being propagated as thought, which is a void element, by religious leaders, which is a form element. All these are manifestations of the same void field. Consciousness. Body is an aggregate of atoms. The VF is associated with each atom of the body. The VF is the driver of the body through various stages of life. The EVF sustains the IVF at every stage of life. Thus, the EVF plus VF equal to IF is the first equation of existence. When the VF actuates a speck of dust from the EVF, a living element, a living entity is born. IVF minus VF equal to I. When the VF exits the IVF, what is left behind is the I. The I is the dead wood which is returned to the EVF by cremation or burial. I is symbolic of the temporal ego or aham of a person. Universal consciousness. Consciousness is the ability of the IVF to respond to its own EVF. The VF is thus the actuator of both the IVF and the EVF. We recognize this entity as the universal consciousness or God. We are all embedded in the universal consciousness or the VF. Thus, we are all connected together. This fact facilitates transcendental communication, thought communication to nature, and transcendental meditation and remote simulation. Void spin model of the mind. The IVF is defined by two forms, the virtual form or VF or the mind, the temporal form TF or the body. VF is the repository of thought, intellect and memory. TF translates thought into action. TF interacts with the world. VF and TF are contiguous and inseparable. Any injury to the TF impacts the VF. Similarly, defects in the VF impact the TF. Other interesting concepts. The book goes on to describe a lot of interesting concepts like universe as a continuum of consciousness, the process of cognition and void spin model of the mind, the hierarchy of spiritual versus material needs, PCDR, the principle of purpose, commitment, destiny, and resilience, governing our actions in life. Transformation of the mind by meditational techniques, disease and cure, the altruistic prognosis, and towards an egalitarian, graceful society.